Hello class, and welcome to your Chapter 9 lecture where we're going to cover community corrections. This is going to look at juvenile probation, including its functions, risk needs assessments, and programming. We're also going to look at the roles and responsibilities of probation officers and cover community corrections programs. So our learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end you should be able to describe probation, explain how probation is administered, explain the functions of probation services, summarize the roles and responsibilities of probation officers, describe programs that engage in risk control and crime reduction, explain how probation can be revoked and the rights of probationers, summarize juvenile probation's effectiveness, describe residential programs in the community, and evaluate the effectiveness of community-based programs. So starting off with probation. Probation is a correctional service that allows an individual to remain in the community under supervision by officers of the court. This is a non-punitive legal disposition for delinquent youth that really emphasizes treatment without using incarceration. So probation can refer to a few different things. It can refer to disposition in lieu of institutionalization. So an individual is placed on probation. That's the disposition. It's the status of a juvenile who has been adjudicated. They are a probationer. It's also a subsystem of the larger juvenile justice system that we've been covering thus far. It's just one portion of that. And probation also refers to the activities, functions, and services between the juvenile court, the individual, and the community. So the basic goal is really to provide services to the youth to help them avoid future delinquent behavior. And there are roughly 300,000 youth who are placed on probation each year, which is more than 60% of all juvenile dispositions. Now, how is probation administered? There's a few different ways. It can be either local or state and executive, or a combination of the two. So with local responsibility, the Community Corrections Act says that they will provide financial assistance to departments so that they can provide services and programs. When it's under local responsibility, the citizens and community agencies are really more readily able to support the needs of the individuals because they know the local needs of that population. They're also more able to be more flexible, and they're less encumbered by bureaucracy. So when you have local responsibility, this would be like your county agencies. So in Pennsylvania, we do operate as a county-based system. While we do have state parole for adults, all juveniles are held at the local level, at the county level, whether they're on probation or aftercare, which would be the equivalent to parole in adult court. So we're really able to tailor the services and the programming that we offer to what our youth in our specific county need, because we know that can look very different. If you want to compare, for example, Philadelphia County to a more rural county like Erie or maybe Luzerne, if you get out to the western part of the state, their needs would be very different. Some arguments against local administration, though, says that the state administered probation can really set standards of service for uniformity across the state. So you do have a little bit of a sort of broken system when we're looking at county levels, and that's because each county is going to determine what rules, standards, procedures, and policies they want to set. So while there are procedures and guidelines that each county can follow, it really is up to them as to how that's going to look. Arguments against local administration also include that large agencies can make more effective use of funds, and there's just greater efficiency in the disposition of resources. When we look at state or executive administered probation, they're able to be standardized in their policy making, in their recruitment and training, and even personnel management. Everything is very bureaucratic, it's structured, everyone is held to the same standards within the state. And then there's echelons, unfortunately, of decision making with that bureaucracy, which can lead to sort of shuffling of memos from desk to desk, which would be sort of one of the downsides to having state or executive administered probation, is that it takes a while to have a policy implemented, to implement change, a new procedure, because there are so many levels that it needs to get through of approval. Whereas at the local level, the county level, which I work in, it's much easier to just have a deputy chief and a chief of that department sign off on a new policy. Or you can have it where it's a combination of the two. So every state operates differently. What are some of the functions now of probation? So probation handles intake hearings. They also handle management of caseloads. They handle supervising and investigating and surveilling youth who are on supervision. And they also write reports to the courts. So there's a lot of use of private contractors for intensive probation and aftercare services, which really just helps to supplement the work of the probation officer because we can't be there every single day for these individuals. So you can use private contractors for additional aftercare services, while the probation officer may meet with a very high risk juvenile once a week. You can have a service that could be there every day in the home, giving you information, giving you reports, so that you're able to do all of these other functions that's a requirement of your job. Then we also have probation subsidy programs, which are just really used to encourage counties to decrease the commitment of offenders to state institutions by reimbursing them for placing youth locally. So we really try to keep youth within a driving distance of their families. We don't want to take them out of the home at all costs. At all costs, we would like to keep them in the home. So that's why we use a lot of community-based programs, specifically in juvenile probation, to support the whole child, but also the whole family, which is the structure in which they live. So here's just a graphic, and we're going to go into a little bit more about each of these different responsibilities of the probation officer, but it really is a multifaceted job and every day is going to look different. There's a lot of different areas you're responsible for. So let's start with intake. So intake is a preliminary investigation that an intake officer would be responsible for conducting. Now, typically your intake officers are going to be your more seasoned officers. They are the officers who have been around for a while. They know the system well. They have that knowledge and expertise that they can use to have appropriate professional discretion in making decisions for that case that are very serious. So typically we don't put newer officers in intake positions in juvenile justice. So they're there to advise youth and parents of their legal rights. They will interview offenders, the parents, witnesses. They'll get information from victims. They'll talk to their neighbors, to peers, to the arresting officer. So they're really gathering during this investigation a lot of information on the juvenile to report that back to the court. So again, they'll collect records, and then they have to, of course, read any prior probation reports and review any police reports. That all goes into this decision making. Talking about management of caseloads now, so you would have essentially a line staff probation officer or a supervising probation officer where they're responsible for maintaining the file on each juvenile, and that file is going to include notes from meetings, any evaluations the juvenile has had, records from school or even service providers. They will have all their court reports in there and the court orders, so they know exactly what the juvenile is supposed to do. Now, most counties keep physical files. However, there is a case management system that the state uses to maintain all of these records as well. The idea is to get everything as much electronic as possible, but sometimes it's still nice to have a physical file when you need to go down to court and you need to quickly reference something, or if you're meeting with a juvenile and you want to go back and double check a note or see what the court order said, they're also helpful to have on hand with you. They're also responsible for categorizing probationers based on their risk level, and we use a risk needs assessment, which we'll talk about in a moment, to determine what their risk level is. And then having smaller caseloads also equals lower recidivism rates. So unfortunately, sometimes there's not much you can do with how high caseloads are, but I will say they have been decreasing Around COVID, they decreased, and they've been steadily increasing slightly, but they're still lower than they were pre-COVID. So the less individuals a probation officer has to be responsible for, the more they're able to directly service that individual, which then leads to a decrease in recidivism. Now, part of that case management, so that's just really the case management portion. Now we're talking about how they supervise, investigate, and surveil these juveniles. So the probation officer must be able to establish sort of a personal contact and personal relationship with the juvenile. And length of time under supervision can vary by state. So for Pennsylvania, it's up to the age of 21. It doesn't have to be, but we can keep a juvenile on supervision until they're 21 if they still need treatment, rehabilitation, and supervision, and we're providing services. So sometimes there are set time frames, like we talked about earlier, that it may be a set time frame of 6 months, or it may be a set time frame of 1 year or 5 years. But in Pennsylvania, while consent decrees will typically be given a 6-month or a year time frame, probation itself is not given a time frame. It is whenever the juvenile has been adequately rehabilitated. So they're responsible then for supervising the youth at home, in the community, at school, and if a juvenile is placed in an institution facility, then you would go see the juvenile there. So really you meet the juvenile where they're at. That's what we always say in juvenile justice. Meet them where they're at. You aren't going to have the juvenile typically come into the office for meetings unless it's absolutely necessary, just because the parents have to take off of work typically to get them in there then. They don't really have a way into the office, and you're really not getting to know the juvenile as well if you would have met with them in the community, in their home or in their own settings, where you can see how they interact with others. Then it's a matter of making sure that you're matching the youth with appropriate services and programs, whether it's based on those risk needs assessments or on other psychological, mental health assessments they've had, and really having a balanced approach to probation. So again, we follow the BARGE, or the Balance and Restorative Justice model, which emphasizes community protection, competency development in the juvenile, and accountability. So it's having this balanced approach to keeping them accountable, but also knowing that you're there really for rehabilitation, because the whole goal is to give them the skills and services and programming and education necessary so that they can be successful adults and that they don't reoffend. So using those evidence-based programs that we know work to reduce recidivism. So how do we classify juveniles on probation? Well, they're categorized using needs and or the risk that they pose to the community. So criminogenic needs are simply attitudes and behaviors that lead to or are related to delinquent behavior. So crim is the crime, genic is producing, so essentially it's just crime producing needs, if that helps you remember criminogenic. So again, here you have your risk level. This is just an example of possible contacts that a probation officer would be required to have based on the risk level of an individual. So an individual who is, say, a minimum risk, maybe 1 juvenile contact per month and a parental contact every other month. For a high-risk juvenile, though, you would be seeing them possibly 4 times a month. Typically, that's going to be weekly. And then making sure that you're meeting or having some type of contact with the parent twice per month. This just ensures that we have proper dosage and duration, that we're not over-supervising youth who are going to self-correct, those who are lower risk, but that we're giving those who are higher risk enough attention that they don't have the opportunity to reoffend. Now, another role you're responsible for as a probation officer are writing reports to the court and delivering that court report in court for that court hearing. So these can be considered a social history or a social study report. And this is what's typically ordered by a judge in those bifurcated hearings. So again, if you're going to have a non-bifurcated hearing where the adjudication and disposition happens at the same time, the judge is not going to have this report available, because you can't start on this investigative quest until the juvenile has been adjudicated or admits to committing the crimes. But in a bifurcated hearing, then the juvenile has already been adjudicated, and you can start on all of this investigative background for the judge to have at the disposition hearing. So the investigation that's completed by the probation officer is going to include all of these different aspects. They're going to take into account all of these different areas in making a recommendation to the court, whether that's to be placed on probation, ordered a consent decree or placement, or whether they're going to order certain services or treatment and programming. So you really need to know all of the programs that are available for these juveniles and know them well enough to match the juvenile to the appropriate service for them. So some roles and responsibilities generally of probation officers. You're going to have this sort of role conflict because on one hand, you are sort of like law enforcement. I would say it's more court enforcement because technically probation officers are not law enforcement. We are officers of the court. So essentially all of the cases are assigned to, so the judge is the overseer of these cases. And we are simply sort of agents of the court that are supervising that case for the judge. So you still have this idea of this sort of law enforcement role where you have to make sure that they're complying with court-ordered conditions, that they're not out there getting rearrested. But on the other hand, you're also playing this treatment role where you're making sure that they're engaging in services, and not just engaging in the services, but that you're talking with them about how they're doing with that program, that you're in contact with the program and you're able to reinforce the skills that they're learning within those programs. So you have to remain knowledgeable about behavioral and development of children and adolescents. And in a way, we're sort of brokers of services when you're trying to match juveniles to the appropriate services. You're sort of being a broker there. And then just some other responsibilities that we sort of covered. Obviously, you're going to have contact with the youthful offenders. You're going to be writing reports and enforcing those conditions. You may even have to detain youth and transport them. So certain counties will carry firearms and other weapons. Other counties do not carry those. So that is going to depend on whatever county that you work for. And then again, making referrals to services and placements. So an effective probation officer, here's what it takes. You need to be able to create a genuine relationship with your probationer. They will know, and I'm telling you, juveniles will know if you are faking it. So you have to be genuine. You need to treat others with respect, kindness, and compassion, because there are often times where these juveniles are living in situations and environments that have contributed to their offending. You cannot be gullible, which can be hard because they can be very convincing at times. You need to go in with all the information and have all of your information when you're going to talk to a youth about something. You also have to remain positive and encouraging of others. You need to be self-aware when maybe a case is getting to you, or if you can't work with a certain juvenile, which happens very rarely. But if there is something going on, you have to be self-aware enough to go talk to your supervisor about that issue. And you need to be committed to the job. This is not a job where you can just clock in, go through the motions, and clock out. You truly have to be invested or you are going to get burnt out very easily. So just to talk about a few of the programs that we have, or the services that probation would be responsible for sort of being a broker toward. You have restitution programs where restitution can be paid typically through financial institutions or financial restitution, so they're actually paying the money back, or they can complete community service or provided direct service to the victims. So say a juvenile graffitied on the side of someone's wall, they could be responsible for going and cleaning that up. That could be a type of restitution. Or probation officers, then the responsibility of them would be to determine the eligibility for participation within these different programs. Say that's a work crew, which certain probation departments will have work crews where they'll go out and take a couple juveniles to SPCAs or YMCAs, community centers, even parks and libraries to do community service where they can pay off their restitution. POs are responsible for calculating how much the juvenile owes, assessing the individual's ability to pay, and coming up with a payment plan, and then monitoring their performance in these different work crews or services and to see how they're doing paying this money back. Some intermediate punishments that we have available. So intermediate or intensive supervision programs are when we place high-risk offenders on really small caseloads so they can have really frequent contact with their probation officer. So there's increased contact, surveillance, typically external controls, say like house arrest, which we'll talk about in a moment, and increasing the amount of treatment that the person has. Typically, they're going to have less than 15 cases and make a minimum of 3 contacts each week. Typically, they'll have to contact the parent or guardian at least once a week, and the probation term is typically about 6 to 12 months for this. type of program. So I know Philadelphia actually has one of these, and I'm close with one of their JPOs who runs this, is in this intensive unit. And he does say that it is sort of your most high risk, violent juveniles. And he has very frequent contact. I think he said he has about 10 to 12 juveniles that he's responsible for. And he sees them at least maybe 3 to 5 times a week. So really just keeping on top of these youth and making sure they're doing what they need to do. So then we have house arrest and electronic monitoring. So approximately 20% of individuals are monitored in their home. So there's two differences here between house arrest and electronic monitoring. House arrest is when the youth needs to just remain confined in their home. So you can use a bracelet to do this electronically, or sometimes we've even just placed youth on house restriction, where we tell them, all right, you can't leave the home, and then you have another service in place that can check in and make sure they are in fact staying home. Or you have the electronic monitor, or EM, which is going to track the youth through that bracelet 24/7, no matter where they are. So you can have that type of electronic monitor, which is really the GPS system, or you can have victim notification systems, which are sort of an electronic tracking system that tells the victim where the juvenile is at stage in the process, or if they're incarcerated. You can also have different identity verification and ignition interlock. We don't see these too much with youth. I will say mostly it's going to be house arrest and electronic monitoring. So some of the goals here of electronic monitoring, which are really important, is that we're able to increase the number of youth that we do release home safely. So say you have a juvenile detained and you don't think placement is quite appropriate, but you need that extra level of supervision to know where they are. Electronic monitoring or house arrest is a great option. It also does reduce the number of youth that are then returned to detention for violations, because as things are happening, you can be on them right away. Say they leave the house and go down to the corner, and you know that they're probably hanging out with their buddies, you can go down there and address that immediately. So it may not come to the idea then of having to violate the juvenile, because you're able to get on their behavior quickly so they can stop. It also reduces the number of field contacts that you need to have with that juvenile, because you know where they are. We can reunite juveniles with their families who are in placement quicker, because we know that we can monitor them. So it's sort of a step down coming out of placement. And then they're also, again, able to return to their home schools more quickly, which is very important to keep them on track for graduation. Now, when we revoke an individual's probation, there's a few court cases that we have to look at here that really sets the standard for these revocation hearings. So Mempa v. Ray said that the Sixth Amendment right to counsel also applies at sentencing hearings. And then Gagnon v. Scarpelli says that counsel should be provided when the probationer denies a violation or reasons for the violation are complex. So all of our juveniles will have an attorney present at a violation hearing. I've had to testify at violation hearings before when the juvenile denied the violations. So it's just important that they have legal counsel present when these are happening, because typically the disposition of the juvenile will change as a result of that violation. Typically it would increase. So some of the rights that juveniles have at revocation, they do have the right to a hearing. They also have right to a 5-day notice of when that hearing is going to occur. And just like at a trial, they have the right to confront witnesses, which is why I would have to testify. And they have a right to see the reports that probation writes that cite the reasons for the violations and what those violations are, so that they can have a proper defense to those violations. Now, how effective is juvenile probation? It actually is more effective than any other method of rehabilitation that we have. And a large number of offenders that are incarcerated really could be placed on probation without increasing the risk of recidivism. So we have seen that in recent years. I'll say there's really been a huge push to reduce out-of-home placements for juveniles and keep them on supervision, keep them in their communities. Probationers do have lower violation rates than parolees or juveniles who have been placed in a facility and then have come back home. And intensive supervision has been associated with lower recidivism rates. We use risk needs assessments, which are very effective at making sure that we are assessing risk and needs comprehensively, but also consistently across the department, so that it doesn't depend what probation officer you get. This assessment is going to tell you what that person's needs are. We make referrals to community-based programs and use graduated sanctions and responses. So that means that as the behavior or severity of the behavior increases, the severity of the accountability measure increases. But also as that decreases, then we can decrease our response as probation officers. And then talking about program reviews and evaluation, this is really the quality assurance piece, which is ensuring that the programs that we're using are working and making sure that the programs that we're using are delivering the full program and all of the services necessary that we are expecting them to deliver to this juvenile. So the last two things I want to talk about are day treatment and group homes, and then we'll sum this up. So in a day treatment program, youth are going to spend their days at the program, but then they get to go home at night. So they get to sleep in their own beds. These are going to be more cost effective than regular residential programs because they're not having to fully house, clothe, feed, and take care of all of the needs of the juvenile. They can still get all of those other services within the community. And generally they serve male populations, but you have some that'll serve female populations as well. And one example that the text gives is AMI Kids, where they have individual goals that are related to diving, ship handling skills, first aid, photography, life saving, and they provide a variety of services such as substance abuse after school programs. They include wilderness and even volunteering. So they really just work with kids during the day to develop some of these skills. And then the juvenile gets to go home at night. In a group home, this is now going to be a single dwelling that's owned or rented by either an organization or an agency where they're just going to house these juveniles. So it's not a residential facility. By looks, it's going to look like a regular home. Typically, you'll have house parents who are going to also act as counselors. And again, has the appearance of just a regular home. It's not going to look like an institution. So they're able to utilize the community for resources and services. So typically you'll see more dependent and neglected youth being placed in group homes, but we do use group homes as well for delinquent youth when that would be a little bit of a better fit for the juvenile than placing them in an institutional setting. So they're going to be more treatment oriented, and they use what's called guided group interaction oftentimes, which really just helps develop positive pro-social group culture among that group. So they really try and get all of the kids that are there to have this sort of like a positive group mentality where they're all looking out for each other. Some of the purposes of using a group home is that one, is an alternative to institutionalization for these different types of juveniles who are not very serious or violent offenders. It's viewed as a short-term placement, so typically youth will be there maybe 3 to 6 months. They're not meant to be long-term. And it's used for halfway in or halfway out, which is important to know the difference here. Youth who are halfway in are those youth who are on supervision and they're just really having trouble following the conditions of supervision, but maybe they're not reoffending, so they don't need an institutional placement, sort of something in the middle. So they're really halfway in to being in placement. Those youth who are halfway out are the youth who are transitioning from an institution or a residential placement and they're coming home on probation. So they're halfway out of placement. And it's really just used as an intermediate to slowly reintegrate them back into their homes. So the House of Emoja was actually a project where this mother's son got involved with gangs, and she would start to invite gang members to stay in her home, and she would start to teach them how to cook and work. It worked as an extended family. So they learned about family strengths, some tribal concepts, and African value systems. And for the youth to stay living with her, they had to remain drug-free, and they were obviously encouraged to maintain good grades. So that worked out well, sort of as a group home type facility where, again, you're giving that youth the home feel, but they're getting all those additional services. We have a few examples. There's a concerned treatment unit for boys in Pennsylvania, and Bethany Children's Home is another larger group home. So in sum, probation can be administered locally, at the state level, executively, or a combination. We have risk and needs assessments that are going to assist with the classification of probationers. And probation officers are responsible for a variety of levels that the juvenile is going to face, whether it's the intake, caseload management, supervision and investigation, and even report writing and court presentation. Intensive supervision programs are just one form of intermediate punishment that youth can be placed on. And restitution is going to be ordered at disposition, which really requires a juvenile to pay the victim back in some form or fashion. House arrest is going to confine a youthful offender to their home, while an electronic monitor is going to track the individual and their whereabouts. Probationers do have certain rights during a revocation hearing, and probation has been effective at reducing recidivism while providing supervision to offenders. Lastly, day treatment programs and group homes can be used when probation alone isn't enough, but the juvenile really hasn't graduated to the level of needing residential programming. So this was your Chapter 9 lecture looking at community corrections, more specifically juvenile probation. If you have any questions, always feel free to reach out, and I do hope everyone has a wonderful week.